So this week we're going to talk about how not to do trade shows. And we're actually going to split this into two parts, one this week, one next week. This week we're going to focus more on the sales aspect of how to make a trade show work. Next week we'll focus on the marketing aspects. Owen, how should we not be doing trade shows?
Yeah, so I have a lot of strong feelings about trade shows. If you've known me for any length of time, I've probably heard some of them. So when I think about trade shows, I think for purposes of this conversation, I'm generally thinking about the smaller size companies that are exhibiting. So not your Thermo Scientifics and your PerkinElmers that have mega booths. That's an entirely different proposition. If you're a small company and you're running a 10 by 10 space, like hundreds of other vendors at a show, what should you not be doing there? And so I think before you get to that, it's important to stop and think, why are you there in the first place? Why did you book this trade show? Hopefully there was a reason behind it, and it wasn't because you had money left in the budget and you needed a way to spend it, and this trade show salesperson called you with a good pitch. Generally, I think the reason a lot of people go to shows is to get sales leads or to build a pool of prospects. And it's important to differentiate those two ideas, right? Because Dale and many others say 95% of your target market isn't in buying mode right now. So you can pretty much apply that to your trade show attendees. 95% of them are not going to be in buying mode. If you, let's say you're standing at the booth and you are doing a random sample of people that are walking by and you're scanning their badges, 95% of those are not going to be in market for your product. So I think it's important to look at that and say, okay, what do we not want to do? We don't want to be showing up at the trade show just to scan badges. I think that's a critical mistake. Would you disagree with that, Dale?
No, absolutely. And again, the one thing you can do at a trade show you can't do anywhere else is have a face-to-face conversation.
Right.
And you can have face-to-face conversations at scale. And there really isn't another mechanism to accomplish that.
And so those face-to-face conversations, those are going to be you're going to get a variety of people. So you're going to have a small number of in-market leads, and maybe you walk away from a trade show with 2 or 3 people that are in market and have a problem that your product can solve. Other people are going to be, they're not going to be aware of the problems that they have. They're not going to be aware of your company and what your company does. And so it's an opportunity for you to talk with them and learn more about what they're doing, how they perceive their problems, and how they perceive your value proposition. So you're able to really scale test your value proposition in live action with a bunch of people that are related to your target market. Another important use of trade shows is to meet your current customers. So if you already have a book of business and this is a show that your customer base attends, this is an excellent time to have face-to-face meetings. Think about the effort that's required to get someone's attention for a face-to-face meeting outside of a trade show, the travel that's required, the time that they have to allocate for that, and then think about how many of those you could possibly do in a week. At a trade show, you can easily have a dozen quality meetings, one-on-one, every day of the show. And those meetings, ideally, you're pre-planning those. Those aren't spontaneous where you bump into the person. You've done your research ahead of time and you said, okay, who do I know that's going to be at the show? Who's on the speaker list that I know? Who's on the speaker list that I want to meet? And set those meetings up one-on-one ahead of time. If you're not doing that, you're making you're losing a lot of value that a trade show has to offer.
Yeah, and so I've known Owen for some time, but we never met until the AACC show in Anaheim back at the end of July. And one of the things I did was I reached out to him a couple of weeks before the show, see if he was going to be there and to line up a time to get together. And I did that with a number of people, which also points out that a lot of these benefits do not require you to have a booth. Talking to prospective customers, to existing customers, none of that really requires having a booth to be able to get those benefits. Now, I think the booth provides additional benefits, but probably the most powerful part of that show is going to be those face-to-face meetings, and you don't need a booth for that.
Right. So I'll slight disagree with you on that, which is that, so AACC is a perfect example, right? So I had a handful of prearranged meetings, and this is my first time at the Anaheim Convention Center. And there was like nowhere really that was like open seating where you could actually sit down and talk with somebody for 15 minutes without having other people, competitors or other customers right at your elbows, right? So you go to other conference centers like San Diego has plenty of spaces to be able to do that. Anaheim had none. And so if you walk around the AACC conference in Anaheim, you see pretty much every exhibitor there has a table and a set of chairs in their booth. And that's the value add at the booth there is basically it's your sort of mini conference room. If you go to bio, you don't have this problem because they've got the cloisters or the cubicles or whatever. Sometimes you really need that space because otherwise there's nowhere to actually sit down and actually have a conversation at some length.
Yeah, and that's a good point. It's useful to know ahead of time what facilities like that are available. We were just before we started the live, we were talking about the Clinical Virology Symposium, which is a much smaller, more highly focused conference. And there was a ton of rooms that were available. So anytime you wanted a meeting, you could just grab a small room. And
at Orlando, you could grab like a whole spare hall. That place was enormous.
Yeah. Yeah. It depends on the convention center there.
Yeah, absolutely. Thinking about some more of the don'ts when it comes to the tactics of trade show execution. I see this happen a lot. Vendors, exhibitors, you have too many people in your booth. You only need 1 to 2, unless you're using it as actual meeting space for your prearranged meetings. You only need 1 or 2 people there at a time. More than that, it's intimidating. Nobody wants to walk up to a group of 5 people wearing the same polo shirt who are all staring at you. And one of them's like aiming a badge, maybe more than one is aiming a badge scanner in your direction. It's not cool. For that sort of lead capture function of the booth where you're scanning badges and people are walking by, I think it's a low value activity. You only need 1 to 2 people at a time to handle that. The conversations that you're going to have with random people that walk up, they don't need to last very long. The only goal of that initial encounter is really to be able to get enough credibility and momentum to be able to schedule a one-on-one follow-up. Ideally, you're doing that follow-up at the same event. You say, hey, do you have time later this afternoon? We can sit somewhere and talk a little bit more about this problem. That's a great way to handle it. You don't want them standing in front of your booth for too long.
Although some of it depends on how big the booth is. If you've got a 40 by 10, you can probably put more people in. But certainly the standard is a 10 by 10. Right. And 2 or 3 people.
And of course, if somebody comes up and says, hey, I want to discuss a $10 million contract with you, we can make an exception for that. But most of the time, again, you don't want to have too many people in your booth is the goal. And the expectations of those people is really just to capture information and to be able to ask some questions about the lead so that whatever follow-up happens is going to be relevant and pertinent.
Because you're probably not going to close deals necessarily right there on the convention floor.
Right.
This is the first contact and an opportunity to define what they're really looking for and whether or not you can help them with that.
Right. And so this kind of rolls into another problem or not problem, half opportunity. A lot of times when you have a big, let's say you're selling into the neuroscience research market and you have in your company a handful of neuroscientists, you've got maybe a couple marketing people, 3 or 4 salespeople, everybody wants to go to that. And so you might end up with 4, 5, 6 people from your company that are badged in and are able to help at the booth. Somebody has to be in charge there. And this is a mistake that people make is there's not one person that's in charge. There's not a duty roster that's set up for who's going to be on booth duty at a certain time and who's not. And what the duty roster helps you do is then if I'm one of a team of 6 people, then I know, okay, I need to allocate these 3 hours on Tuesday and Wednesday to be at the booth, but the rest of the time I can plan for myself. That's when I can set my prearranged meetings. That's when I can pick out a talk or 2 that I want to attend. That's when I can actually maybe bow out and take some much needed rest during that period. So somebody's got to be in charge and somebody's got to set up a schedule that people need to follow. And if you're not on duty, you should be doing something else.
And that needs to be planned out ahead of time and should be fairly structured. I've done conferences where we would have 7 or 8 people and we would rotate people in on 2 or 3 hour shifts during the time the exhibit floor is open, where we would keep 2 or 3 people in the booth. There'd be another 3 or 4 people that were either in prearranged meetings or walking the floor, looking at what else is going on there.
Yep.
Because again, the other advantage there is you get a chance to look at your competitors.
Yep. So here's another don't for you. Don't show up without having trained your people ahead of time. Too often we have, and I think this is good. I think it's good when people that aren't regularly meeting face-to-face with customers are able to do so in the context of a trade show. I think there's like an efficiency benefit to that where you can spend a couple of days, you can actually talk face-to-face with customers and prospective customers. And then you go back to your marketing cubicle and you are a little bit better informed about what's happening. A lot of times we'll also get like a scientist or maybe a field scientist in the booth as well. Everybody should be trained as to, okay, what's the expectation when you're standing in the booth as to what you're going to produce and how you're going to talk? What's the elevator pitch? That should be tested and rehearsed ahead of time. It's okay for people to have different styles and to have different pitches, but there's no excuse for spending $10,000 on a booth and then showing up and the elevator pitch is inconsistent or people are uncertain about how to interact with other people because it's not part of their day-to-day routine.
Yeah. And one of the things that I've done is pre-training meetings in the week or two before the conference and have a very specific sort of do not talk about topics.
Yeah.
And especially if you have scientists from out of the R&D group, there is a tendency to basically TMI, just way too much information.
Yeah.
Because you don't want to give away what you're working on. It's easy to spill competitive secrets that seem very obvious and common to somebody in the R&D group, but is the sort of thing you just don't, for a variety of reasons. You don't want to be talking about future products.
Yep.
And the worst thing that you can do is talk about how amazing the next version is going to be, which is what developers tend to love to do. Because what's going to happen is if you're convincing that the next version is amazing, your customer's response is going to be, that's great. I'll wait till the next version comes out.
Yeah.
And that's not what you want. You need to get people on board now. And quite frankly, there are entire companies that have gone bankrupt because of this exact issue. There's a famous one from many years ago, Osborne Computer, where the founder of the company just couldn't shut up. And so he's talked obsessively about how amazing the next version of the Osborne Computer was going to be. And people were so convinced that their sales went to zero and they didn't have enough money to finish the development work. And this was actually in the early 80s. And Steve Jobs was a close friend of Adam Osborne and watched the company collapse. Fastest company to get to 100 million and back to zero at that time in history. And the sort of long-term secrecy that Apple has had about future product releases came directly from Steve Jobs' experience of watching Osborne Computer just run the car over the side of the cliff.
So that's an easy problem to avoid if you're trained to do this next thing. So the next thing is going to be, don't spend too much time talking about yourself and your product. Somebody just walks up to the booth, they saw your splashy graphic or at the tagline and it caught their interest. Give them a little bit, give them like 15, 30 seconds about who you are and what you do so they know. You should try to turn the conversation to get information about them quickly. This is something that a lot of salespeople understand through training or through intuition. A lot of people not in sales make the mistake on the other side. And you're put into a situation where you are standing in a booth and you think, okay, you're expected to be able to talk about what's happening. A lot of times you have founders and scientists that are actually quite passionate about what they're doing. But this is the 3-minute encounter that you have is a very valuable opportunity to get information from the customer. We're already scanning their badge. You already know what their name is. We can look them up on Zoom info. We can get back to them and we can plaster them with emails and paper mail and event invites and whatever for the rest of the time. But for the 3 minutes that they're standing in front of us, that's a golden opportunity to ask questions of them about their experiences are, what their problems are, so that when we do go back to them for a follow-up, that can actually work.
Right. And at the end of the day, that customer is not interested in your product. They're interested in their problem. And if you can't get a good read on what's the problem they're trying to solve, you're going to have a difficult time at that point forward trying to sell them something.
Right.
And this goes to what you say on your booth, what you say in your materials as well, is there tends to be an obsessive focus with the details of the product. And at the end of the day, pretty much nobody cares about the details of the product. They care whether or not it's going to solve their one specific narrow problem. And if you can address that, you're going to get a lot more interest.
Yes. And they also care. It's also important to remember that they also care about the person standing in front of them. So I think we're curious about each other in an individual context as well. And so to the extent that you can personalize what you're saying with your own experience and expose some of your own personality and credibility, that can only help you.
One other thing I throw in too is that if this is a venue where you're going to be able to meet with what are potential major new accounts, don't send a junior salesperson. You need the CEO there. You need the head of R&D, the head of product development there. Because if you're going to have a CEO level conversation with if you're talking to a client and you're talking to the CEO, or you're talking to a PI, and you're a 23-year-old junior salesperson, it's a very different conversation than if the CEO of the company is having that conversation with the PI or having that conversation with a CEO.
So do you deploy that person to the booth, or do you use them outside the booth?
Usually outside the booth, because usually what we're doing is we're working ahead of time before the conference to try to line up these meetings. If we're able to line up high value meetings with higher level personnel, then we need some C-level people to show up, because there's going to be a lot more credibility. And the other thing is that you want people to show up for the meetings you set. And it's a lot easier to blow off a meeting with a junior sales rep than it is to blow off a meeting with the CEO of the company or the VP of R&D. Mm-hmm. And these most important meetings are going to be more successful at every level if you've got somebody that is peer level with them that you're setting up the meeting with.
So that segues me into another don't. So don't ignore side events. So this is maybe a pet peeve of mine. So I've done a lot of trade shows over the years, and companies that I've worked for, if you're doing a Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday show, they'll be like, oh, hey, Monday, let's do a team building dinner. And they take a group of 12 people from the company out to this nice restaurant. I like that. I like being wined and dined when it's on somebody else's tab. But that should not happen on Monday night or Tuesday night. If you're doing a Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday show, typically your setup's going to be Sunday afternoon. That's when you want to do your team building event. Or if you can convince your crew to stick around long enough, do it after teardown on Wednesday. Monday and Tuesday nights, if you have 4, 5, 6 people there, you should be out entertaining people. You should be entertaining your clients, entertaining your prospects, putting together dinners on the fly with people that you are networking with at the show. A lot of people show up to a trade show and they don't necessarily have plans. They're coming from out of town. They may or may not know anybody else at the show. And I've had a lot of success putting together spontaneous dinner invitations just from people that I meet at poster sessions or at talks. And that's a much better use of your time than going out with your 4, 5, 6 colleagues for an event on Monday or Tuesday night.
And the other tactical thing there that I've done and I've seen used to good effect is pre-schedule a group dinner during the conference. Line up ahead of time key people you want to talk to, existing customers, prospective customers, for this evening group dinner. Be willing to add names to that dinner that you run into spontaneously during the conference. And if necessary, drop, and you have to get everybody on board ahead of time, but drop junior names from inside the company. So if you've got a table for 12 that you've reserved, and you need to do this before the conference, you need a certain number of higher level people from the company at that table, but you can drop junior people to make room for prospects, because the purpose of the conference isn't a vacation for your employees. It's an opportunity to meet with prospects. And the deal with these group dinners is, again, it allows you to get in front of customers at scale. And so again, within a single evening, you can be in front of a dozen different people in a very intimate setting and have very extended conversations, and much more extended conversations than you're going to have on the trade show floor.
It's a golden opportunity to have customers talk to each other, right? Because it's a lot harder to do that outside the setting of an event like a conference.
Right. And especially if you're mixing existing customers that are there plus prospective customers, then you have more credible voices talking about what your product is and how it's being used and what it really does. Now, that assumes you don't have a bad product, but that voice of other customers is going to be far more powerful than what your salesperson says or even what your CEO says. I think we're at the end of our time. So next week, we're going to hit the other half of this, which is the marketing stuff. What needs to be thought about in booth design? What does the booth need to accomplish? Your marketing collateral, your leave behinds, your swag. Enormous amount of money is wasted on worthless swag, as well as the pre-work, the marketing pre-work that needs to be done in the 6 to 8 weeks leading up to a conference if you really want to be able to make that conference pay off, because these are high dollar expenditures typically. And it's hard to do even a minimal booth with a half a dozen people for under $25,000 or $30,000, it's easy to spend $70,000 or $80,000. And obviously the really huge booths, they're dropping seven figures on a single appearance. And so these are expensive events. So the challenge is, how do you get the absolute best return for that investment?